Okay, hey folks, Mark Locklear here with this quick screencast on Chapter 12, Part 1. So I sent an email out earlier today on Chapter 12. I think what I'm going to do is break up, after reading through Chapter 12. It's just a very dense chapter, which many of these chapters are. You've probably heard me say that before, but I was trying to come up with assignments that would sort of encompass the whole chapter, and I feel like I just feel like it's going to be more difficult than what it needs to be, and there's really no reason to rush through this, especially I think with this change in it, this being moving to an entirely online class. So we're going to break Chapter 12 up into two parts, and basically what we're going to do is, and I'm looking at the book down in front of me now, the basic skills for built-in arrays section, and then how to work with C strings. We're going to do that with part 1, and then the last part of that chapter, which is some really tough concepts, advanced skills for built-in arrays. That covers things like searching, sorting, and two-dimensional arrays. We'll do that in part 2, so that'll be the week after next, or I'm sorry, we're in the week now. Anyway, we'll do that for part 2, and we'll have a separate coding assignment for that. Only one quiz though. The way the test banks are set up, all the questions are by chapter, so there's no way for me to break out different parts of the chapter. So you'll only have a single quiz for Chapter 12, but there'll be a coding assignment for part 1 and part 2. Okay. So I'm just going to say a few words. About built-in arrays and C strings. We'll look at an example of some arrays, some funkiness, what I like to think of in arrays, and then I think as an example, a little coding exercise. I'll get you started on. This is exercise 3, the modifying the test scores program. I'll get you maybe halfway through that, just or at least get the ball rolling for you on conceptually what I'd like you to do. So for this first section of the chapter, built-in arrays. So we've talked about arrays previously. So arrays act very similar. They're very similar to vectors and some other data structures that we've looked at, but the basic arrays have some sort of, they're sort of more basic and more fundamental, I guess maybe you'd say, than the other data structures are. Again, with vectors, we don't have to know the size at compile time. They can sort of grow as you add more elements to them. With arrays, we have to be explicit about the number of elements that we want when we actually instantiate them or write the code. So when we say at compile time, that's what we mean, that when you actually write the code, we need to be explicit about it then. Looping through arrays, and then comparing and copying arrays. The examples they use basically use for loops for all of those things. So I think that's pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of implementing what the code examples that they give you there. What I did think was curious was this concept of array decay. And let me share. I think I'm just going to share this desktop. That'll be the easiest way to do it. I don't know if I'm on the right one or not. Okay, I'm going to assume that I am. So this idea of array decay, so this is the test scores app we're going to look at. Let's look at array decay first. So this is covered on page, yeah, so this has to do with when you're passing an array to a function. There's sort of a curious characteristic of this in C++, and that is this idea of array decay. And basically what it is when you pass an array, you can't pass by value. I mean, we talked about this earlier in the chapter or earlier in the book when we talked about passing by reference versus passing by value. And all object-oriented programs have some implementation of that. But in this case, in C++, anytime you pass an array to a function, it always has to be essentially passed by reference is what's going to happen. So when you pass an array, you're not actually passing the array, you're passing a pointer to the first element in the array. Now this has a lot of advantages to it from a from a simplicity standpoint or from an efficiency standpoint, I guess you'd say. So, you can imagine a scenario where you've got an array that's, 100,000 or 500,000 or, 5 million elements. When you would pass that, if you have to make a copy of an array that large and then pass it on to a function, then now you've got two copies of a million, let's say a million element array that have to be held in memory. Now, obviously, that's not a very efficient way to handle data. So the idea here is if I've got this million element array, and when I pass it, I'm not passing that all million of those elements. I'm only passing a reference to the address space where the first element lives, and then that way I can subsequently either traverse it, sort it, do whatever I want to it. So this is a little bit of the example. This is the example that I have on page, I think it's page 445. And so if I run this, I would encourage you to run this and sort of play with it some and see, but you can see this array before passing the function is 20 bytes. And that is here. And notice the 4 bytes come from, or the 20 bytes comes from, each one of these elements is 4 bytes. So 4 times 5 is 20 in this case. So that's that. Now notice we've got this display array function. Notice we're passing nums to it. So we're passing the nums array to it, which has 5 elements. And then we're also passing the size. So another characteristic of this is when you pass an array to a function, again, you're only passing a pointer to the first element in the array. So the function doesn't have any idea of how long it is. The function doesn't know how many elements are in the array that you're passing. So that's why that has to be passed as a separate value. So in this case, we're passing nums and size to the display array element. And then notice we're doing size of nums here. And notice in this case, the array after passing the function is 8 bytes. And that 8 bytes is just, that's the size of a memory space. Your numbers may be slightly different if you're using Windows. I'm on Mac, but I suspect they'll be the same. But anyway, I just thought it was worth mentioning that. I actually posted this in a public in Asheville's Coders League, and just say, hey, how many folks are familiar with the term array decay? And I think there was one person that knew about it. But again, it's just a C++ thing. I mean, a lot of what we learn is going to be universal across many programming languages, but this concept of array decay is uniquely a C++ one. So I just thought I'd mention that. So that is arrays. As far as C strings go, so I've got a little assignment for you. Should be fairly straightforward. Again, you're going to look at page 457 is going to include the functions that I'm asking you to use. It's sort of a contrived program. I'm asking you to enter your name, and if it matches my name, then you're gonna display a certain message on the console, and then you're going to get the person's last name, and then you're going to tell them the total number of characters in it. So hopefully there won't be any issues there, but if you have any questions, let me know. Looping through, I'm just looking at the book here to look at the topics for C strings. I mean, C strings are very similar to strings, but they've got their differences too. I'll let the book go into, handle the details there, but certainly if you have any questions, just let me know. Okay, with that being said, let's look at exercise 3. I'm just going to, again, just get you started on what you want to do there. And also, I think seeing me code will sort of help give you a sense. Lots of times, new developers especially don't always know sort of how to get started or how to organize their thoughts when it comes to things like this. So, so just you watching me code, again, I think may be helpful from that standpoint. So this is exercise 3 in Moodle, and I'm asking you to modify the test score programs. The test score program is on page 449. Keep in mind, this program is in your student files, so you don't need to code it up. I mean, you can code it up if you like. I wouldn't recommend that you do that. But you certainly can. But you can just open up the book code and then either modify it there in that application, or if you want to make a copy of it so you can preserve the original program, you might want to do that also. So generally, when you first open up an application like this, one of the book applications or sample exercises, it's just good practice to go ahead and run it and just make sure it runs. So all this program does is allow you to keep entering test scores until you hit -1, 75, and then let's say you bombed an assignment 2. So let's say you got a 35 on one. And so when I enter -1, it's going to exit, and then it's going to give me a score count, a total, and an average. So what I'm asking you to do here is, first off, just modify the program so that it accepts 10 elements or 10 scores rather than 50 scores. I won't do that. I think you should be able to handle that. Now the other one is so this last one that I'm asking you to do is going to have multiple parts to it. So I'm saying rather than keep all the scores in a single array, and in this case the default they're called scores. There's a scores array. It says let's keep the failing scores, so those scores below 70, in an array called failing scores, and then we want to calculate the total we need. So to calculate the total, we're going to need to combine the failing scores and then the passing scores. We'll rename that array, and then we'll pass that to the calculate total method. Okay, so just so we're familiarizing ourselves with the program, here's our calculate total method. And again, this is we're passing an array, in this case the scores array, along with the score count. So the first thing I'm going to do here is, since we know we're going to be modifying scores, I'm going to change this, and there's different ways to approach this. You can handle it different ways. I'm going to go ahead and change passing, or I'm going to go ahead and replace the scores array with passing scores. And one nice way to do this, if you're working inside a program like this, and again, you have to be careful with it, but I'm going to do find and replace. And I'm going to find, let's see, find in project. Find and replace. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to find scores, and I'm going to replace. Now, if you're on Mac and you're using Xcode, yours will look like this, but Visual Studio is going to have the same type of setup where you can do a find and replace. Basically, I'm just looking for the string scores, and I'm going to replace it with passing scores, because that's what I want my new array to be called. Because keep in mind, so passing scores is going to take care of scores that are above, that are 70 and above, and then we're going to create a failing scores array, and the scores that are less than 70 we're going to send to that failing scores array. So the way I'm going to handle this is I'm going to rename scores to passing underscore scores. Notice too, it gives you this handy little area here that actually shows you all of the spots inside the program where scores appears, and this is what's going to actually be replaced. So this is handy to say, for whatever reason, there may be an area that you wouldn't want. So in fact, you notice there's a couple cout statements that have scores that I wouldn't want to replace, but it's going to be easy to just do a search and replace for all these, and then I can go back and modify the cout statements to make them look like this rather than having passing scores in there. But with that done, I'm going to go ahead and looking for the replace all button. Okay, here we go. So you notice anywhere, so here's this, originally this was the scores array. I've changed this to passing scores. And then you see passing scores here. And then passing scores is what's being passed down to total count. And then we can see it here too. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and compile and run this program again just to make sure nothing broke and it still works the way I would expect it to work. And let's say we've got all higher grades here, so it'll be easy to sort of tell if our average looks right. So our average looks okay, so we're good to go there. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a failing scores array. I'm just going to cut and paste this, paste it here, and I'm going to change this to failing scores. Failing scores, okay. That looks okay. I'm getting a message that I've got an unused variable here called failing scores. That's fine. The next thing I'm going to do is, so now that we've got two arrays, passing scores and failing scores, we're going to want to modify our if-else statement here to get the failing scores in the failing scores array and the passing scores in the passing scores array. So right now, the existing functionality says anything that's greater than a -1, it's going to put inside passing scores, because remember we changed the name. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, put this here. So if a score is greater than 69, then we're going to add it to the passing scores. Else if a score is less than 70, we're going to add it to failing scores. Now, the way this if-else statement is structured, we should catch anything that's a -1. Like if this else if was higher in the code path, if it was up above this -1, then if you put in -5, let's say, it would be added to failing scores. But in this case, since this else if is first, anything that's less than -1 should get caught inside this statement, and then we should get this score can't be a negative number. And in fact, we can run this now. Now would be a good time to sort of run that and test it. So build succeeds. That looks good. If we do a -1, yeah, so that's not what I would expect. Well, score can't be a negative number. See, I'm not sure if that's the correct behavior or not. Let's put in some Ballad scores here. 23, 44, 99. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, -1 was actually end it. So then let's put -1 in here. That's okay. It's less than -1. So this generally looks right here, although there's something that's not quite right with it, because we're only passing the passing scores and we're not including the failing scores. But I want to try one more thing here. If I do a -10. Okay, right. So this is working as I would expect it to, right? I forgot the -1 is to actually end the program. So I can put scores in here, and then 99, anything above 70 is going into the passing scores array. Anything below is going into failing scores. If it's below -1, so like -2, then I get the error message, can't be a negative number, and then I can do -1 to end it. So I think that's all working the way I would want it to do too. Okay, so I'm just going to pause for a second. So there's another array that I need here, right? So I'm just going to pause for a second, and you can pause the video now if you want. Think about what you think our next move is, and then when you're sort of done thinking about that, or maybe you think you have an answer, unpause it and continue playing, and we'll see what we're going to do next. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do here is we need a scores array, right? We've got a passing scores array, we've got a failing scores array. Now we need to combine those, because the total scores is what we want to send to this calculate total function. So I'm going to do this inside here. And so I think I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to actually do it, but I'll just sort of put some statements. So lots of times when I'm getting into more complicated logic here, I'll just do comments like this, and sort of just sort of write a sentence or two about what it is I need to accomplish, and then I'll go back and fill in the code later. So we know we need, so I'm going to say create, create scores array. And actually this should go up top here, right? We should initialize this up top with these other, with the other arrays. So I'm going to say create scores array. And then I want to copy. So then when I'm down here, so at this point, again, I've got failing and passing scores arrays that I've populated. And so at this point, I need to copy failing scores array and passing scores array. To scores array. And then I also need to, so here, rather than passing scores to the calculate total function, I'm going to want to pass the scores array. Okay. The book gives you an example of how to copy arrays. So essentially, you're just going to take both of those arrays and copy them or populate or add them to the scores array. And that should take care of the functionality for you. So I'm going to stop there. Certainly let me know if you have any questions. I'll be able to, I can certainly give hints or give you a nudge or lead you in the right direction you need to go. So that's all for now for chapter 7. Good luck. Again, I hope everyone's staying safe, and just let me know if you have questions. Thanks.